I recently went to a museum in Aarhus, Denmark. On the roof of the museum, there's an art installation. It is basically a circular tunnel that people can walk through. The idea is that if two people enter and one goes one way and the other one goes the other, they will see the cities through different color lenses and have a different perspective on how it looks. If they were to describe the city to a third person, the result will be a richer mixture of both. That, in a nutshell, is what I want to talk to you about today. How bringing a variety of social cultural perspectives to solve problems leads to better results. This is something that has helped me a lot throughout my career, but it took me a while to figure this out. I was born in a small suburb outside of Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina. And yes, I am Latino. I'm also an architect, but that came later. You see, in Argentina, it is not a big deal to be Latino. But even so, I was always the kid that didn't fit in. My brothers and I were among the few Jewish kids in a very traditional Christian school. I was the only boy in the whole country of Argentina not interested in playing, watching, or even talking about soccer. And in high school, I also realized that I was not that interested in girls. I always fell out of place. But I also learned early on that the more awkward I felt, the more empowered I felt. The more I was immersed in other cultures, in other people's beliefs other than my own, that feeling of awkwardness made me feel wiser, and it allowed me to think bigger. And that ultimately became my strongest tool as a designer. In the meantime, sometimes I feel like this, super uncomfortable. Many of you might have heard about the train pushers in Japan. It's bizarre, right? But context is everything. Japan packs a large population into a small space. Train workers may have the job of pushing commuters onto the crowded train to ensure that the doors can close without trapping the commuter. Now, the commuters oftentimes thank the train employee, as from their perspective, the train employee is actually helping them. Now, if you think a commuter in New York City would react differently to being shoved onto the train, it's only because you're using your own social cultural perspective to understand that behavior. In Argentina, we don't have train pushers, but there was a time when I experienced the mental version of that Japanese subway. In 2001, the economy in Argentina collapsed. In 1 week, I graduated from architecture school. The firm that I was working for decided to close, and our government instituted the corralito. Corralito was the informal name given to the measures taken in Argentina to stop a bank run. The corralito pretty much froze our bank accounts. The word is the diminutive form of corral, which means animal pen. And that's exactly how I felt, trapped in like a small animal. So much, I felt so uncomfortable and so out of place that I decided to leave. I moved to Miami. I had found a job with a design firm, and the next 7 years were filled with the usual experiences of a junior designer making his way up. Then guess what happened in 2008? Another economic collapse. My firm was shrinking fast, everyone around me was in panic, but I'd been through this rodeo, or corralito. I was again uncomfortable with my own situation. But instead of panicking, I started conversations with Starbucks about a potential job opportunity. The great news is Starbucks offered me a job. The bad news is I had to move to Seattle to take it, the furthest possible point I could go in the US map. Now, many of you might be thinking, what's so bad about Seattle? It's a great city, it's beautiful, it's green, it's great. But believe me, it was a major culture shock. You see, in Miami, I was just another Latino, but in Seattle, not so much. I know when people think about Starbucks, they think about the stores and the baristas who come in all sizes, shapes, colors, especially colors. It's hair, tattoos, skin tones. It's really a rainbow out there. But as a reminder, Seattle has a strong Scandinavian influence with later migration from Asian countries. That place is not only predominantly wet, it is also predominantly white. So here I am in my first experience in corporate America, and I'm 3,297 miles away from my comfort zone. It is cold and damp out there. I don't really know anyone. I'm the guy from Argentina. I was always introduced that way, even after almost 5 years with the company. I remember once during a performance review where my manager told me, "You are doing so well, but you're not just quite the right cultural fit." To this day, I still wonder what he meant by that. So here I was feeling totally uncomfortable, totally out of place. But here's when I started to recognize that it is when I feel this way that I actually do my best work. I started realizing that the idea of surrounding yourself with people who are smarter than you is actually all thinking. Our world is too complicated for that, and our problems are too complex. In today's interconnected world, it is not enough to surround yourself with people who are smarter than you. You need to surround yourself with people as different as you can find. People who look, act, and see the world differently than you. Case in point, Starbucks in Japan about 9 years ago when I was still working there. We're having trouble creating a store identity for that market. We're basically importing the American-style store, and no one was really that interested. So instead of doing the design work ourselves, we decided to hire a very famous Japanese architect. And this was very uncomfortable for us, to accept that he was the expert and that we needed his perspective. The result was a huge departure for us, but instead of fighting it, we embraced it. This store sparked a changing process, and from this point on, this market started creating stores that were truly inspiring and original. Okay, so Catherine Phillips is a professor at Columbia Business School. She looked at decades of research on this topic of diversity and problem solving. And the evidence clearly shows that groups with diversity of race, ethnicity, gender, and gender orientation and sexual orientation, what are known as socially diverse groups, are more innovative than homogeneous groups. And this is not only because people with new backgrounds bring new information. It is also because, as Phillips says, interacting with people who are different forces group members to prepare better, to anticipate alternative viewpoints, and to expect that reaching consensus will actually take effort. In other words, diversity helps us bring our best game. And companies are getting it too. Some of the most enlightened companies are baking social diversity into their culture as a business strategy. We need to get comfortable with discomfort. Instead of avoiding that feeling, you have to embrace it. And when you do so, it actually means that you're learning. And that's what I come to understand. I know that when I'm feeling awkward and out of place, that is the first step towards finding the strongest solution I can find to a problem. Many of you are probably familiar with the process of design thinking. It's what all designers are trained to do, and it's now being applied to situations beyond buildings or products. But does it go far enough? Design thinking as a formal process is very good at championing a multidisciplinary approach, but it is not as deliberate as it could be at integrating social cultural differences. And this is true at every step, but particularly in the first three. When we empathize, when we define a problem, and when we ideate solutions around those problems, those social cultural perspectives play a key role. Let me show you an example. This is a Brazilian favela, which means slum in Portuguese. The favelas are infamous shanty towns that grew along the margins of urban areas. The favelas have no formal infrastructure and certainly no building codes or regulations. But if the favelas are a picture of poverty and neglect, they're also a marvel of resourcefulness and creativity. And that ingenuity is what inspired the Brazilian designer Campana Brothers to design this piece. At a first glance, it appears to be a designer's indulgence in the impractical. But it's actually quite the opposite. It was developed as a no technology required solution based on the resourcefulness of the people who live in the favelas. The first one was produced near a fruit market, where there is plenty of scrap wood available. The Campana brothers used glue and nails to connect one piece of wood to the other with no rationality beyond the goal of just making a chair. So look at this, even something with a negative social cultural connotation can actually be inspirational. Now, I have to admit that not all of their solutions is that simple to explain. Or take these examples from my current employer, Marriott. Here's a typical guest room. Can you guess where this is? It is actually in Beijing, but I could argue that it could be anywhere. And in fact, it was. For a long time, you could find the same guest room in Charlotte, in Seattle, in London, in Buenos Aires. But over the last 7 years, we've embarked in a transformation for the Marriott brand. We are now connecting with those local markets, and we're getting uncomfortable. And we're using our own social cultural differences to influence design. So today, if you stay in our property in Charlotte, North Carolina, you will find a rich history of craftsmanship and furniture building as part of the design. In the coast of Shenzhen in China, the connection with the outdoors is carried through the design with artwork that reflects the local geography. And in Oakland, California, the use of industrial materials and local woods pays tribute to the city's past and present. Here's the last thing I want to leave you with. Public bathrooms. Public bathrooms are the latest proxy for arguments about how our society views gender and gender roles. What if we look at what all the different sides are concerned about and finally design solutions that work for everyone? But before we get there, how did we get here in the first place? It is not, as many believe, an issue of ideology, an issue of anatomy or biology. Instead, it's an issue of ideology. Gender-specific restrooms are the legacy of what's known as the separate spheres moral belief system of the early 19th century that dictated the appropriate place for women in society, at home, taking care of children and chores. Many laws arose in the era in the context of increased urbanization and women entering the workplace, and the laws that public restrooms be separated by sex are some of the few that still remain. Historically, by the way, shared public latrines have been a feature of most communities, and this continues to be true in many developing countries. Obviously, these do not achieve what we want and need in terms of comfort, privacy, or hygiene, but they do have one advantage. They are convenient and they're accessible to everyone. Here and in Europe, we're increasingly seeing the use of gender-neutral restrooms. Governments and schools are designating third gender-neutral restrooms in order to accommodate transgender students or citizens. But this option is not ideal. It actually sets apart people who already feel marginalized. Now, the heart of the issue is about keeping people physically and emotionally safe, right? Some say it's about protecting women or unaccompanied children. Others say it's about transgender people, people with disabilities who may need assistance. So rather than debate who may or not be at risk, let's just take the idea of safety to heart and ensure that everyone feels safe in a public restroom. So how do we do that? If we look at the retail world and many industries, we're increasingly seeing a trend towards more gender-neutral products and experiences. Less his, hers, less pink, blue, more integration. And this trend extends to fitting rooms, which are gradually moving from hard-to-find perimeter spaces to front and center unisex rooms. This more communal, public, and human approach makes sense for restrooms as well. So here's a design for a communal bathroom in a school. It is centrally located instead of hidden and closed off. It has 2 access points and facilities that are in full view of the wider public, which actually improves safety and security. It also improves convenience and even hygiene, with more hand washing and more impetus on keeping the area tidy. And completely private, with fully enclosed stalls for privacy and dignity of every user. Problem solved, right? Well, almost. Designing a public restroom that everyone feels comfortable is actually quite easy. Now it's a matter of changing the maze of building codes and regulations that today, in many places, prevent us from building such facilities. A different TED Talk. So here's my ask. Value social cultural differences as part of your daily life. Expose yourself to different ideas, people, and cultures. Courageously share your own differences, always with respect, but without apology. Get out there, get very uncomfortable, and learn. Thank you.